Uh, Hello, everyone, and welcome to our V.A.C. Roundtable number 51. Needless to say, we're back for more, and we brought somebody else who we have a great deal of respect for and towards, and this is Dr. Bryon Adinoff, and he has been around, needless to say, a little bit. Go through a little bit of a bio. Dr. Adinoff is an addiction psychiatrist and academician. He is presently a clinical professor at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. He retired in 2018 as Distinguished Professor of Alcohol and Drug Abuse Research in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, and as a psychiatrist for 30 years with Department of VA Affairs. Where he served as director of substance use disorder treatment programs at both the Charleston, South Carolina and Dallas, Texas VA Medical Center. He is also, of course, with and representing the Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. So thank you, Dr. Adinoff, for joining us this evening.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
I would also like to thank Veterans Action Council members Al Byrne, George Armstrong, Pius from over in England, Wade Laughter, and Michael Green for joining us tonight. So we'll start off. We're here to ask some questions of the fine doctor. So we're going to start off with the first question, which will be simple one that all of us are kind of curious because everybody has a unique experience regarding us. Dr. Adinoff, how did you first get exposed to cannabis? When did you first hear of it? What was your first exposure to it?
So this is with the assumption that I have used it, which is a fair assumption.
Maybe you never have. You know, if it's up to you to tell us truth or no.
And there is some risk actually in that. Well, I guess you're talking about a long time ago. So it's an interesting. Well, all your questions are interesting, but that we have lined up. But this one got me thinking back, and in fact, I was texting with my brother and sister about it today when I was 13 and we went to Haight-Ashbury on a family trip. And I remember this, we were walking through and there was a tall guy with a beard and long hair, a hippie. And he looks at me, kind of nods his head like, hey, brother. And I thought, hey, that's cool. And I was very aware at that time that when I get a chance to try cannabis, I would. And a couple of years later, a good friend of mine, I heard that he had been using. And so I said something to him. We rode the bus every day together. And I don't know, probably a couple weeks later was the first time I tried it. And I don't think it did much for me. I actually tried it about 4 times over the next 6 months. My friends were more active than me. I've never been big on using drugs or drinking through my life. But one of them got caught by his parents and he told on the rest of us. And my parents get this call at 2:00 in the morning and they come and wake me up. And I said to myself, I'm busted. And I mean, this is, what are we talking, 66? I mean, it was just so upsetting to my folks that I didn't use again for 1.5 years until probably late junior year, senior year, at which point, enough was enough. And I used more frequently at that point. So it was a kind of rocky start.
Interesting. Well, everybody has their own unique situations that we've experienced. So very interesting. Haight-Ashbury. Right on. All right. Well, next up will be Council Member Al Byrne with our next question.
Doctor, again, we as a group and me personally, we're very welcoming to you. You've got a hell of a resume, sir. Very impressive. And part of that resume was that you were a NIDA researcher, National Institute for Drug Abuse work. And I'm curious, this is my question I submitted, that when you work for them or when you were around them or however you want to describe that, did you find a bias within that organization towards studies, research, ideas even that might come up with a positive for cannabis as a medicine or recreational use or whatever?
Well, let me back up a little bit. I did research primarily in brain imaging that was funded by NIDA. So I actually worked for the VA, and I worked for the last many years of my career for the state of Texas at University of Texas Southwestern. So I was never employed by NIDA. What they did do was fund my research, primarily in imaging, but also treatment. But I didn't do anything in cannabis. But I think your question is, did NIDA have a bias? Now, NIDA is, as you said, the National Institute of Drug Abuse. Their job is to explore, understand, and to treat drug abuse disorders. So they are not mandated, it's not part of their mandate to do research on cannabis as a medicine. So if you're looking to see, well, does cannabis work for PTSD? Well, that would be mental health. If you're wondering, is it good for pain? Well, that would be for an institute that, studies pain. And so people often blame NIDA for not doing these studies when it really was not something that they're funded to do, and they would have a problem with Congress if they were doing these kind of studies. That being said, NIDA has done a lot of the work in terms of the animal studies, the preclinical studies, that has really done a lot to advance our understanding of cannabis. Now, but I think the question to me is, when they were looking at the downsides, the damages, the consequences of drug use, was there a bias towards finding things bad about cannabis? And were the researchers biased? And were the journals biased? And the answer to that is, their job was to find bad things about drugs. Their job was not to find good things. So as a researcher, if I found that cannabis had a good effect and I wrote that up, I wouldn't be able to get another grant, because what do I have to go on? Their job is to find out bad things. And so all we did was find out bad things about it, because those were either, the researchers were, we're always biased to find what we're looking for, whether it's conscious or not. And I'm editor of a journal, the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse. And, I prefer to publish a study that shows a difference one way or the other than one that doesn't show anything. So if all you got is if you do all this work and find that, oh, geez, there's no consequences to kids using cannabis. Nora Balkow, the director of NIDA, doesn't want to hear that. She's relented a bit, quite a bit actually, she's pulled back, but that there is, by nature of what the Institute's mission is and the need to get funding and who's funding it, we have to pose our questions so that it's of interest to the funder, and we have to package our results so that they can get published. So if we came up with a study that was looking at cannabis use and kids and found that all the kids, like the ABCD study, a giant multi-million-dollar study that's looking at brain imaging and all sorts of other things in over 10,000 kids starting at 9 years of age, I'll be very interested to see what happens if all of a sudden we find out that the kids, I don't think this will happen, but if the kids who are using cannabis, the earlier they use, the better they do in life. That's going to be really tough for the Institute to deal with.
No, thank you for bringing
that. Was very good.
Go ahead, Al.
Yeah, that was a very good avenue. Thank you very much.
It's clear. It's also it helps people understand because they have this curiosity about how science is funded and how do we arrive where we are currently. And sometimes people don't understand the basics behind, what these organizations do. So having someone like yourself who has not only immersed yourself in it, but survived through it. It's just a reality that people need to be aware of because, that's just, you have to get yourself financed so you can get yourself published so that you can get peer reviewed so that the discussion can actually, take on further. It's not an easy thing to do.
We all answer to somebody and we all get co-opted by something.
Yes, so there's always an editor out there somewhere. All right. Well, thank you, Doctor. The next question will go to Councilmember Michael Krawitz. Councilmember Krawitz.
Thank you, Etienne. It's great to see you, Dr. Adinoff. I wanted to preface this question with just a brief statement that I believe if cannabis were never put under control in the first place, that it would have been, I think, like Kenzie, our good buddy Kenzie Rivulet said, it would probably have been regulated a lot like capsicum. That the plant itself, you can grow hot peppers, chili peppers in your yard. If you want to make an herbal medicine or something like that, you can. If you want to make a pharmaceutical out of that, the pharmaceutical rules control that, etc. If it's a food, the food rules control that. In other words, the product is what's regulated, not the plant. And I think that that's the way cannabis would have been. But here we are, where cannabis was highly regulated and even prohibited around the world, and we're coming out of that. And I realize when we're in Vienna that we're talking about cannabis medicine. That's what we talk about in terms of medicinal use. But they think pharma, they think pharmaceuticals, they think, oh, we need to have, what was that use again? Oh, do we have double-blind placebo-based studies for that particular use? And I don't think we need double-blind placebo-based studies for every single use that we want to use cannabis for. That it should just be an herbal medicine that you get, and that it's free of pesticides and stuff like that. So, this medicine versus medicine problem, we have our idea of what medicine is and they have their idea of what medicine is. And that just prefaced the question that I wrote, which was, how do we define medicine in the 21st century without winding up in a conversation about pharma?
Yeah, this question got me thinking as well. I don't think in the world we live in, you can discuss cannabis without pharma. They're too big, they're too powerful, they're too rich, and they're too influential. So they're there. Now there's a couple things you mentioned that I think you get to the crux is we have the plant and then we have the extracts, the synthetics, the cannabinoids, various cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, and so like Marinol, where you can make a synthetic THC. That's where I see pharma or Epidiolex. So in order to presently, the way the FDA is and has been since it started, they look at a very isolated compound, an isolated molecule. And they're not really set up to look at a plant. So the FDA is going to presumably continue to study, assess applications from pharmaceuticals for isolated cannabinoids or other constituents of cannabis as medicines, and they will go through the regulatory process. Now, what's really difficult, and this is particularly going to be an issue on a federal level in terms of how are we going to regulate the plant. There is no good answer for that. The way it presently is, there's botanical, a division of the FDA that is focused on botanicals, but still they're looking at extracts of botanicals. And to meet the criteria for the FDA for a plant, you would have to have it exactly the same strain is going to be exactly the same every time you grow it, wherever you grow it. So it's going to have to be grown under the same humidity, same temperature, the same genetics, and I don't know that that can actually be done. And each medicine that is approved by the FDA takes about $100 million. So, you got to walk into a dispensary, you've got several dozen strains to choose from. No one's going to spend billions of dollars to get all these approved. So how is that going to work, and who's going to regulate it, and who has a system to regulate it? And that's very unclear at the moment. So I think pharma is going to have a place for the cannabinoids, but I struggle to see how it's going to work to have a pharmaceutical be in charge of the plant or have input into the plant. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely.
And I had, incidentally, I had an interesting conversation with Amanda Kane at Dave Joyce's, the Republican congressman. Y'all told me was the real deal, and boy, they're very knowledgeable, really good folks. He is sponsoring a bill called Prepare that is going to be trying to get all the different parts of the government that might have a say in cannabis and figure out, before we actually have the federal legislation, how is this going to work? Because his office really recognizes that this is going to be a big problem that we haven't had to address before.
No, and that's something we spoke with their office when we visited with them in September, and we'll carry that conversation forward when we meet with them again in May. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. It's very insightful there, Doctor. Next up will be Pius with the next question. Councilman.
Hi. My question is, do you recognize the value of real-world evidence in terms of assessing the safety and efficacy of cannabis as a medicine? And if not, how do you see whole plant cannabis being fitted into the RCT model?
Okay. So do I value real-world evidence? That'd be a tough one to say no to, I think. But saying that, we all presumably believe what we see and believe what we feel and believe what we hear, yet we all have much different perceptions of reality. I mean, look at politically. We're all living in the same country, and yet we can have dramatically different perspectives on things. And also, real world evidence as a physician, one is always suspect, and why we turn to the FDA so much, because we can be unduly influenced by our own experience and the recency. So if we give a medication to somebody and they get better right away, and then another one does, well, we're going to be more inclined to prescribe that medication, which may or may not. We were working from a very small sample, so we rely on randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, in order to take away our own bias and do these studies in the most unbiased way you can. There's no reason that you can't do a randomized controlled trial with cannabis. You could extract out the THC from the plant, give one group cannabis, one not. I think that's tricky because, number one, well, getting back to all the strains, we have so many strains. Are you going to do a randomized controlled trial that costs hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on all the different strains? That's going to be very difficult, if not impossible and really not feasible. Can you do a double-blinded study with cannabis? It's like psychedelics. They do double-blinded trials with psychedelics. And personally, I wonder if it's even ethical, because you are putting somebody in a study in a placebo group where they're not going to get any benefit, and it's a waste because, boy, you can tell the difference between tripping and not tripping. I mean, there's no placebo there. And I think the same would be true certainly for cannabis if you're looking at THC. So I don't know. Right now, we've been doing a lot of more what you were referring to as real world trials by asking people, and there's a lot of, I think industry and different dispensaries are looking at just questionnaires. There's recently a study published looking at, what was the outcome? You've seen it. I think pain, opioid use in those who are, is published in the, I think a JAMA journal, looking at lots and lots, thousands of people, their opioid use while they were taking cannabis, and their opioid use went down. Now, it's not the same as a randomized controlled trial, but it's powerful evidence.
Thank you, because this was the issue we're facing here in the UK, specifically because our government is asking for, we want RCTs to make this more widely available, because here in the UK, specialist doctors are actually able to write prescriptions for cannabis, but it's considered an unlicensed special. So at the moment, the organization I'm involved in, along with a charity, helping assist in operating a registry of 20,000 patients, collecting all of this data to try and gather as much evidence as possible to then submit here to the MHRA version of the FDA, because we're trying to look at, well, if whole plant cannabis can't fit into the RCT model, how else can we collect data? Because we're finding children, especially with refractory epilepsy, aren't responding to, say, licensed medications like Epidiolex, but are then responding to unlicensed medications, which are whole plant extracts, like Bedrolite from Bedrocan. And a recent study we just published recently found that children given a whole plant extract found a 98% reduction in seizure rates compared to a 30% reduction with just Epidiolex. I just think it's how would you kind of balance that, because you're trying here in the UK, we're trying to please all the pharmaceutical standards and it being treated as medicine, it's all EU GMP. But it's very difficult to gather evidence that the government and the MHRA or even the FDA would find acceptable to approve this as a medicine.
Yeah, and you raised an excellent point with the GMC. Any of these strains that you want to study in these kind of studies, at least in the US for FDA, you have to give a CMC, chemistry, manufacturing control. Which can cost tens of thousands of dollars for an individual strain. So who's going to do that? So dispensaries now think, oh, it's going to be a lot easier to do research. Well, they're still going to have to get an IND, a new drug number from the FDA, and that's going to be enormously expensive. Thinking about, yeah, I once heard I heard a great talk about, well, actually, let me say this before I forget. Another issue in this country with doing randomized controlled trials is if you're participating in a study, you have to go to the lab, get whatever they have, which can be relatively low potency of a particular strain, take a risk of getting placebo, and then do all these, jump through all these hoops. Or you can walk down the street and go to a dispensary and get anything you want. So presently, it's very hard to do these kind of studies in cannabis legal states. The other thing I was going to refer to was cannabis. This gets to George's comment about how it would have been regulated differently. That we all have really horror stories. Got me thinking. I think I'm pretty sure my dad died from a COX-2 inhibitor, which was a non-steroidal pain reliever. This is 15 years ago or so, that was used widely, and then it was found and approved by the FDA, and it was found to cause cardiovascular events. And my dad, he was 81, but he was in really good health. He had just been to a computer class, came home, had a heart attack, and he was on COX-2 inhibitors for hepatic pain, neuropathy. And we all had these kind of stories with medications. And cannabis, we decided as a population here, either legislatively or through ballot, that it is safe enough. So does it really need the kind of evidence that we usually look for, or is it safe enough to trust that it's going to be okay? And so far, I mean, we have our naysayers, both doctors and non-doctors, but in general, there's no state that has tried to go back. And we now have 3/4 of the states have approved medical cannabis. 91% of the population is in favor of it. So it seems to have worked well, even without the regulatory control that we're used to for medicines.
Thank you for that, Doctor. Next up will be Council Member Wade Laughter.
Yes. Again, thank you, Dr. Adinoff. This is a fascinating conversation. As an addiction specialist, and looking through your CV, it was pretty amazing. I'd ask you to rate 5 substances by how addictive they are for most humans. And honestly, I want to add to the list, but I'll stay with the original 5 here. Cocaine, caffeine, nicotine, sugar, and cannabis. And I really want to throw opioids in there, but I'll leave it to you to discuss as you will. And I think back to Michael, or to George's point about the plant versus the drug. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, your question. Now, how you measure addictive, I'm going to go with reinforcement. So you put somebody in a lab, you give them access to the drug. How many times are they going to push a button, or how many times is a rat going to push a button to get that drug? Or what are they going to give up? Or how much money do you have to pay them to make it worth their while not to use it? So let's go with that. With that in mind, I'm going to take sugar out of this, because sugar is a food. It's we need to eat. We need carbohydrates. And the pathway for sugar is much different than it is for drugs that we like to take. So it's really hard to put them in the same category. And so I'm not going to try and do that.
Would you consider substituting alcohol for sugar? Thank you.
Sure, except now it's gotten way trickier. I would go with cocaine is the most addictive. I'd go with nicotine. I hope someone's not looking at the data and gonna fault me on this. So actually I looked for it and it wasn't easy to find clear data that actually ranks them. You can look up harms, how harmful it is to society, to a person, but it's different than addictive. So I would go with cocaine, nicotine, alcohol, cannabis, and caffeine. What do you think?
No, I appreciate that. One of the ways that I think of addiction potential, if you will, is how readily is that substance available to a person. And I think most of the people who have ever smoked cigarettes might put nicotine higher on that list. I don't know, but I really wanted to hear your opinion. Thank you.
Well, I had it right after cocaine.
Cocaine's pretty hard to find if you don't know the right people. You can find
Oh.
cigarettes in every store in America.
So yes, availability, it's going to be, okay, you were defining it differently than I think of it. I was thinking for someone who has taken it, how more likely is it that they're going to go out and use it again?
Yeah, because I made sure sugar was included because one, yes, it is a food. However, it was also one of the first drugs I ever took that gave me that, and they gave me that kind of a now, and I've seen sugar be abused, but more importantly, in the last 30 years or so, I think we're also seeing abuse more so of corn syrup, which I think has replaced sugar, which was necessarily a real food. But I think the dietary reality around, high fructose corn syrup has become a major health problem around the United States, especially among Native populations, and definitely of those that, as we see as it spreads around the world, it seems to be a problem. But I'm surprised you kicked sugar out initially, because I've seen abuse of sugar, and especially it's more common in younger children, why we have to hide sugar away from kids and why we just don't give them the full bag of M&Ms.
Well, I didn't mean to imply that it was not addictive, that it was not reinforcing. It's just trying to put it in a category with drugs was what I was struggling with. How can I conceptualize? How could I conceptualize where it stood? So, for instance, it's pretty hard to get animals, rodents, and things to take cannabis. You can get them to take sugar, but again, what's the concentration? And it's just more tricky to put in a line with the other drugs.
Right, because you need a baseline, and everybody's baseline is different depending on, a diabetic versus somebody who is not.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Maybe we need to get better clarification for ourselves. The doctor was very, very clinical in his breakdown, because as somebody who's used nicotine, and I maybe have done cocaine once or twice, I would say nicotine was much more addictive to me than cocaine was, and was definitely a hard thing to kick. But again, it's all on individual subjectivity here. So
It really is. You talk to, people that have one drink of alcohol and it changed their life. They said they never felt anything like it, and they knew they were addicted from that moment on.
absolutely. All right. Well, our next question will be to Michael Green. Councilmember Green, you're recognized.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Adinoff, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much. We didn't have an opportunity to meet when you were last at the meeting. I actually have two questions, one that the group worked up, and I have my own individual follow-up, if you will. The question I was presented to ask was, according to the FDA, the packaging on the prescription drug Marinol suggests that the patient is acclimated to the synthetic THC, which is the basis of the drug, that they can actually return to driving a vehicle once they're acclimated. So the question becomes, in your opinion, do you believe that that is a good baseline, that acclimation, to judge the ability of a patient to drive as it may equate to cannabis consumption? So I think we're differentiating, correct me if I'm wrong, between Marinol in this baseline and hypothetically and cannabis, which may be consumed in one of a number of ways.
Yeah, this was, I have to reluctantly admit that I did not know this was on the package label. And so of course I went to look, and yeah, it is there, which is really interesting. I guess it's probably not too dissimilar. I didn't look, but is it the same for benzodiazepines and opioids? That it warns you not to drive unless you're acclimated to it, because there's tolerance to all those drugs. Is it a good baseline? It's as good as anything else. I mean, that's trusting somebody to have the knowledge of whether they're incapacitated or not, or whether they should be driving or not, which, you know, is always tricky for anybody. I mean, there's a lot of demented people out there that think they're just fine. Certainly there's a lot of drunk people that think they're just fine. But I don't know anything better. There isn't anything better at this point, which makes it really difficult. We don't have any good way except field sobriety tests that are, I think, somewhat iffy, certainly for cannabis. And we don't have any way to measure intoxication. And in fact, so you read how many people are showing up with positive THC metabolites in their blood, or even THC. And there's been studies showing that THC, the level of THC, is not at all a good measure of how uncoordinated you are, or how ready you are to drive. There's just no relationship. So that's as good a way as any. The problem to me is, well, what do the police do with that? What do we do with that as a society to protect us against people driving intoxicated from cannabis? And I don't have a good answer for that. But what we have now is, well, let's look at 5 micrograms of THC, or the metabolite. Well, that's not really, as I said, it's not a good measure of anything. So it's not really telling us whether somebody's impaired or not.
Yeah, I'm not aware, and I don't know if anybody on the council is, of any really comprehensive study that actually shows the consumption of cannabis necessarily incapacitates someone when they're behind the wheel. So the mere presence of it in the blood,
Well, there's
other tests may not be determinative for that.
There are lab studies where they have, you know, they spent millions of dollars designing these very fancy systems that can measure real small changes in coordination, how aware you are, how alert you are, how coordinated you are when you're using various doses of THC. And they do find decrements. That the real world studies in terms of looking at widely in overall at accidents rates and death rates, those are more problematic. From my read of the literature, being intoxicated from cannabis is like having a V.A.C level of 0.05, which is below drunk driving. And your risk of getting an accident is maybe 1.3 to 2-fold higher than people who are not on cannabis. This compares to 20-fold higher on alcohol. But also, there's all sorts of medications that people take. If you're texting, if you're sleepy, if you're on Benadryl, or Ambien for sleep, or benzos or opioids. All these things also increase our risk for getting in a car accident. So we're talking about, yeah, it may increase risk a little bit, but so do a lot of other drugs. So do a lot of other behaviors.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. ATM, can I proceed with my question? I know there's other
Absolutely. Go
questions.
ahead. And Pius has a
Okay,
follow-up
so-
after that.
It's been I'm a patient of the VA. I enrolled in the system in 2013 or so, or 2014. I've received a tremendous amount of my healthcare now as a senior citizen, as a veteran from the Healthcare Administration, the Veterans Healthcare Administration. And I know that my research is approximately 317,000 medical professionals tied to the VA. I know there's some adjunct practitioners as well. I'm aware that there's about 115 VA medical centers, plus, I don't know, over 1,000 outpatient clinics. My question goes to is me as a patient, when I engage with somebody in the VA system, there's generally an absence of any background information, medical information about cannabis, the endocannabinoid system, things related to that. And that's in my feeling as a patient. If I present that, I would want my healthcare professionals to have some kind of basic understanding. Do you have any suggestions or ideas what this council may be able to do, or I as an individual, to have the VA health system begin to train its medical professions in the fundamentals of medical cannabis science?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this, I just want to make it clear that this is not a VA specific question. This is a question for medicine generally. The endocannabinoid system is the most prevalent neurotransmitter system in the body. And to this day, from what I understand, relatively few medical schools address it. There's no reason for that from a medical scientific perspective. And it's only, we've known about the system for 30 plus years. And yet, and we known about cannabis as a therapeutic for millennia. And yet it's all but ignored. And doctors, I think, are feeling very uncomfortable with it because, Michael, you go to your doctor and try talking about it and they don't know what to say, and you know about it and they don't. And it puts them in a really difficult position. So it's something that I think needs to be addressed, not just through the VA, but through the medical system overall. Colleague of mine recently said, and it's Rachel Knox, you may know her, she's on the board of DFCR, a brilliant woman. She suggested, because there's always these questions about for cannabis docs, do they need special training before you become a cannabis doc? And she suggested just teach them about the endocannabinoid system and let them figure it out from there. Once they realize how prevalent, how important it is to the homeostasis of the body, keeping the body healthy and on target. Once they understand that, and they're hearing all this stuff from their patients and the news and it's in the journals, they can start putting it together and figuring out maybe how they can use it in their practice. So I would do, on a one-to-one basis, I would do what it sounds like you're doing, which is talk to them about it and engaging them in it and getting them to think about it and maybe inspire them to go look it up.
Thank you
But-
for that.
but
And
overall,
besides brought up-
I think there's some question.
Go ahead, sir.
Let me just add, I think there's a question federally, what should we be doing? Should we be, we hate to mandate, med students, schools don't like being mandated, but do you mandate to medical schools that they address this? If so, how many hours and what do they teach? that's a hornet's nest. And remember, every time you teach something, you're taking away time from something else that is somebody's expertise.
Excellent, thank you. Again, I was just going to comment, reason I picked the VA as an example is number one, we are the Veterans Action Council, but two, the Veterans Health Administration, is my understanding, is the largest single healthcare provider in terms of, maybe in the world, but certainly in the United States. Place to start. I certainly agree that the entire medical profession needs to open its mind to what may be available in education. Thank you so very much for the answer. I really truly appreciate it.
Yeah, but you raise a good point. When I was at the VA, you're always getting, you need to take this test. I mean, it's all computerized, and you need to, take 20 minutes of your time, and you need to take this test. And if you don't, they'll shut down your computer. They've actually done that. And you won't be able to see patients or get any of your work done. And so we're used to doing that. There's no reason there's reasons, but they could just throw in, a 20-minute course on endocannabinoids.
Beautiful. Thank you again so very much. Appreciate it. And let me mention too, when I do visit the VA, almost everybody I talk to, medical care professional, they are receptive to hearing this. It's just the system is not built to support it.
It's good to hear.
All right, Pius, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm curious about so in the UK, cannabis, one of the most prevalent conditions cannabis is prescribed for here is substance use disorders. And I'm interested in hearing what your thoughts are on cannabis being used to treat substance use disorders, say like opiate abuse or benzodiazepine abuse.
Okay, so is cannabis useful for substance use disorders?
Yeah.
This is where we get into the I think it was George, the question about real world evidence. Maybe it was Al. There's been no randomized controlled trials, to say the least, with this. And I don't even know if we could get an IRB to approve a study using cannabis for a substance use disorder, probably somewhere, but it would be tricky. And it would be, I can't imagine NIDA funding it, but I also couldn't imagine NIDA funding psychedelic research, and they're doing it now. So there's many things that have happened in the last 10 years, 20 years that I wouldn't thought I'd be having this conversation. So things change. But there's people, Peter Grinspoon, who's on our board. He's Lester Grinspoon's son. Lester wrote the first real, very famous book on cannabis, medical cannabis. And Peter he wrote a book on this, so I'm not betraying any confidence. He had an opioid addiction and got busted, and he said cannabis took him out of it and helped get him off opioids. And, I didn't buy, when I got into this whole area, I got into it because of my concern about social justice. I used drugs when I was younger. Nothing ever happened to me, but I was aware it happened to other people. And I didn't realize it was just typically Black and brown people. But the medical cannabis, to me, and the Drug Policy Alliance, it was really the low-hanging fruit. Well, how can we get people to approve it and vote for it? And let's go with medical cannabis. I didn't really buy into it. The evidence wasn't there. But, once I talked to 5 or 10 or 100 or 200 people whose life it's changed, whether it's PTSD or pain or sleep, then I start going, well, gee, maybe there's something to it. And I think we're there with substance use disorders, and hearing from people that say it really helped them. Now, on the other hand, when I talk to colleagues who are psychiatrists, most of them are very anti-cannabis, because they see people with PTSD or anxiety or depression who are using a lot of cannabis and doing very poorly on it. Because the people that are doing well on it aren't showing up in their office. So it really depends where you're looking. If you're working in an addiction clinic, you're going to see people who maybe were using cannabis to get off, and it made them worse because the ones that did well aren't coming to see them anymore.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer.
Councilmember Byrne, you had a follow-up.
Well, just to support you, Doctor, over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades, I've probably interviewed a couple of thousand veterans. And I have yet to have one tell me that cannabis did not help them in some way to reduce their use of opiates, alcohol, nicotine, in a lot of instances. I mean, a lot of percentages down to 0. Thousands of them. Now, I know that's all, in the press and in your world, that's anecdotal. But to me, when I hear a couple of thousand people tell me the same story, it's beyond anecdotal to me. And I think, I think that really the medical profession is starting to understand that about cannabis. Is the things they can believe are their patients. They should believe their patients. And the patients are telling them this is helping me, and I'm just repeating, but I'm supporting you. And the other thing is, back in 1995, an organization I started went to the American Public Health Association meeting and proposed to that meeting, that conference, that they adopt a policy about medical cannabis, saying that it should be available to the public at large through under medical supervision. And it was approved by 95% of the groups of attendees. And the 5% that did not vote yes were the psychiatrists. So they're still holding strong since 95.
I was on a call last week or this week. It was so disappointing. Just the vehemence.
Well, I'll read it. Our doctors that have led this incident, Dr. Grinspoon, Lester, Todd McArea, these guys are all psychiatrists. And they have taken, over the years, they have taken incredible abuse from their peer group, yet they were right. But I think the psychiatrists, I'm just supporting you again, the psychiatrists, they just don't want this to happen for whatever their reasons are. But thank you.
Thanks for sharing that.
Well, all right. Well, thank you all very much. And I want to first of all thank Dr. Adinoff for being so gracious to accept our questions and have this discussion. We hope that you'll come back and join us again in the future. I know we'll have more questions, needless to say, as things go on. But thank you for joining us tonight. Is there anything, Dr. Adinoff, you'd like to plug, or anything you'd like to state regarding the Doctors for Cannabis Regulation?
Yes. So doctors, thank you. Doctors for Cannabis Regulation was started in 2015. It goes to many of the things we talked about in terms of organized medicine, remains generally quiet, if not antagonistic, towards legalizing cannabis for medical or adult use purposes. And David Nathan, our founder and first president, started DFCR in response to that, because so many of his colleagues said, we ought to legalize this stuff. So we are to my knowledge, the only medical group out there, or physician group out there, that supports the legalization and evidence-based regulation of cannabis. We've got several hundred members, 300 of whom are physicians. And this is the kind of stuff we do: education, a lot of testimony, working with legislators, both federally and local. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with y'all, and obviously as a I'm not a veteran, but someone that's been working with veterans for my career, it's always great to talk to a bunch of veterans.
Well, it's been an honor for us, and needless to say, thank you for your your decades of hard work and dedication. We definitely have great respect for that. But thank you for joining us for our questions, and we look forward to working alongside you at the national and international level. So I'd like to thank our V.A.C. members, Al Byrne, Michael Crowitz, Pius, Michael Green, Wade Laughter. Brian Buckley showed up, and Pearson made a showing in there as well. So thank you, everybody. I am Etienne Fontaine. I'm your host tonight for the V.A.C. number 51, which is Dr. Bryon Adinoff. So thank you, everybody. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the V.A.C. Roundtable number 52. Have a great rest of your night, everybody.